Voting discrimination in the South. The most basic right in a democracy is the right to vote. The African Americans who lived in the South did not have that basic right. Despite the 14th and 15th Amendments guaranteeing civil rights regardless race and color, the African Americans had their right to vote taken away by white statesmen.
From about 1900 to 1965, most of the African Americans who lived in the South of America were not allowed to vote. This was in states such as Louisiana, Alabama, Georgia, and South Carolina. During that period, powerful white men used many methods to keep African Americans from voting. Some of these methods affected not only African Americans, but also poor white people. There were many ways they were kept from voting. One of them was the use of violence in form of threats, beatings, and killings. Sometimes they would also burn their homes, threatened with eviction, denied credit in banks, or lose jobs. Voting rights could also be denied if African American could not read or write. If you could read or own a property as an African American, you were allowed to vote under certain circumstances. If you had a grandparent who voted before 1867, you were allowed to vote, but no African American voted before 1867, so it only benefited white poor people.
As a consequence of African Americans being oppressed by the white men, Martin Luther King started the Civil Rights Movement, which was basically a nonviolent political movement fighting for the African American civil rights. At the height of the Civil Rights Movement, the African American regained their constitutional rights when the president signed into law the Voting Rights Act in 1965, which reinforced the 14th and 15th Amendment for racial minorities.
In the last decades of 18th to the 19th century, the lynching of black people in the United States, mainly in the South, started to become an internalized and ordinary method used by whites to terrorize them, and for some whites it was a way of resolving some of the anger they had not only towards the slaves, but towards the free blacks from the Civil War. Once the freedom was given to the blacks, many people felt that they got away with too much and needed to be controlled. Although the majority were blacks, there were also a percentage of whites, but it was minimal. The whites who got lynched was for helping the black or being anti-lynching. In some states, they did not lynch blacks, and in some other, the plural were whites. In the beginning, it was carried out on someone who were convicted for a crime or felony, but many of them didn't even commit a felony or a crime, but got punished anyway. Most of the lynching were by horrific methods of physical torture, such as burning at the stake, maiming, cutting into pieces, castration, hanging, or shooting, or both. It was big mobs gathered to watch the lynching, and many of them were white families, and they attended like it was a normal social event. Lynching in the United States continued to the 1968. And for more than 80 years, white has trying to show and maintain the superiority of the whites.
Jim Crow laws. The Jim Crow laws were a set of laws enforcing racial segregation in the southern United States. Jim Crow was slang for a black man, so it was laws that controlled the black people. The name Jim Crow is taken from when white people entertained in theaters by painting their faces black and humiliating the black people in the late 1820s. The laws ruled from 1880 up to 1960, where many states and cities enforced them. The laws were many, but some of the most common was the following. Buses. All passenger stations in the state operated by any other motor transportation company shall have separate waiting rooms or space and separate ticket windows for the white and colored races. Alabama. Intermarriage. All marriages between a white person and a Negro are hereby forever prohibited. Florida. Education. The school for white children and the school for Negro children shall be conducted separately. Florida. The reason these laws were made was to isolate the African American from the white American, because apparently the white people were so terrified of the black people that they needed to lower their condition of living. Back in the days where racism had its peak, it was not hating but loving the African American that you looked down upon. For example, if someone called you a nigger lover, it would have the same effect that if you called someone a racist today.